Troops, welcome back to the nation's largest military veteran talk radio show, Frontlines of Freedom. I'm Colonel Denny Gillem. Troops, please do send me your comments and questions. Email me through frontlinesoffreedom.com. Now it's an honor to welcome to the show the president of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, Dr. Matthew Harrison. The Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, or LCMS, has been very active in reaching out to and helping and being supportive of the military community. So what could be more appropriate than to seek an interview with the guy who's, in military terms, the commanding officer? So, welcome to Frontlines of Freedom, Reverend Harrison.
It's great to be here, Colonel. It's a pleasure to speak to you and all of your great listeners, and thank you for your service. Welcome home.
Thank you, sir. Lots of people don't recognize that we Vietnam vets weren't welcomed home, so I appreciate your stepping into that culture.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. And we know the people of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod treasure our religious freedoms, and we know that it's because of men like you who are willing to put it all on the line, and men and women who are still putting it all on the line, that we are free to believe and act religiously as we see fit, and that is a magnificent freedom.
Yes, sir. And freedom isn't free, and it needs to be protected virtually every generation, and that's what we're in the business of, and that's one of the reasons why I am very interested in bringing the faith perspective more heavily into Frontlines of Freedom. So I thank you for joining us. Before we get to serious business, as a military guy who's been a committed Christian for most of his life, I know that in both cultures, military and church, it's important that we use the right titles. So are you president, doctor, reverend, or something else? You've probably been called many something else's, but what would you like me to use?
Yeah, all those things are fine. My mother calls me Matt, but I go by pastor most often.
That works. You know, I go by Denny. Dennis means I'm in trouble. Dennis James means I'm in big trouble, but that was my mother's. So that works. Let's start with your background. When and why did you decide to go into full-time ministry? Is that something that was in your family or what?
Well, it wasn't the history of my family. We grew up going to church regularly, and I think I became interested in things as a high schooler. I became more interested in God and the gospel of Christ and forgiveness. And then we had an intern at our church, a guy who was at the seminary and came for a year to do his internship year at my congregation in Sioux City, Iowa. And I began really to think seriously at that point that that's what I'd like to do.
It's interesting how careers come out. Sometimes people just follow their families, but for most of us, we're doing one thing and something happens and it somehow makes a change and it affects our lives. And in this case, it was the Lord, right?
Yeah, completely so. And I had a wonderful upbringing, really, blessed in many, many different ways. My folks both came from farming backgrounds. Dad was an accountant. Today, my father-in-law is a veteran of World War II, veteran of the Battle of the Bulge, and is a magnificent storehouse of treasures and information for me every time I talk to him.
The World War II vets that are still with us and are still articulate have amazing stories, ones that we better not forget. So what are some of the positions you've held? Obviously, you're a leader, and being a leader, the same thing in the military, the more you assume leadership responsibilities, the further away you get from the grassroots work. How'd that work for you?
Well, it's always an interesting pull and tug. I was a parish pastor at two different parishes, very heavily involved in my communities. At the second parish, we served the poorest census tract in the state of Indiana and unleashed a very successful housing home ownership program, which renovated that entire neighborhood. And we did that in kind of an ecumenical fashion with the Roman Catholics and many others who helped out. I then served the National Church from St. Louis as head of the International Mercy and Relief Effort, LCMS, World Relief and Human Care, and so became involved in all kinds of disaster work, huge multi-million-dollar, $10 million responses to Katrina, to the large tsunami in Asia that took so many lives. And also that brought us into contact when we formed Operation Barnabas.
Thank you, President Harrison, for joining us today. Thank you for your service to our military community and to our Commander-in-Chief. that commander-in-chief I'm talking about is Jesus Christ. Thank you for taking time to join us today.
Thank you. And just like we prayed for Barack Obama all those years, every Sunday we'll be praying for President Trump too.
And that's what we need to do.